Welcome to Shooting Straight with Brad and Casey. I'm Brad Carlyon, your Navajo County attorney. My partner is
Casey Clark, Navajo County Sheriff.
And this month, as our guests, we have Roxanne Padilla and Amy Ferguson with the Navajo County Attorney's Office Victim Services Division. Welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And understand that we're going to talk today about the Navajo County Domestic Violence Coalition. What exactly is that besides a mouthful?
That's actually a really good question because that's the same question I asked myself whenever I was asked to develop it. So the coalition first kind of came about 2 years ago. So we had a public health assessment done and a need that was identified in Navajo County, or an area that needed to have services filled, was in particularly about domestic violence and sexual assault. So at that time, the health department had decided that a coalition could help with that measure, and I was part of that health assessment. And they had asked that the county attorney's office take the lead on developing a coalition. And so the very first question I asked myself is, exactly what is a coalition? Because I definitely did not want to have just another meeting where people met and didn't accomplish anything. And so I, along with some help from the Arizona State Coalition for Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault, they came down and put together like a tentative year-long plan for our coalition. I invited some community partners and members that include other victim services providers who provide services to those types of areas, victims of concern, like our shelter programs, our domestic violence victim advocates, our local emergency room physicians and social services departments, NACASA, who provides a large amount of our, practically almost all of our sexual assault nurse examinations for sexual assault cases. The prosecutors come, and law enforcement, a detective from almost every crime unit, and victim advocates, and we all get together about monthly, and we meet and we have some goals that we like to accomplish. The main purposes of the goals that we like to accomplish are awareness and training and collaborating our responses to victims of domestic violence and sexual assault.
So how long has this coalition been in place?
November of 2015 is when we were first established, and we have a pretty good collection of service providers, and they all come on a pretty regular basis.
So what have you been able to accomplish as this coalition so far?
Well, the first few months I was instructed to, and it was actually very eye-opening to just have all of us as community service providers to these types of victims to sit down and talk about what it is that we actually do, because you would be surprised about how little we actually know about the services that we provide. And we do have services here for those types of crime victims, and we want to make sure that we're filling the gaps to the best of our ability, so we're not overlapping services, because you have, people at the county attorney's office, advocates who help victims through the criminal justice process. But if a victim of domestic violence needs something more like safety planning, they might want to go to the shelter to obtain that type of service. If they need emergency funding, who has those types of resources? How are law enforcement, because a lot of times they're the first people on the scene when a case like this happens, how are they aware and how are they going to make proper referrals to effectively help victims in these types of cases?
So is there funding attached to this? Is it just something more that, we always hear we're doing more with less, or was there any funding or grants that came along with this? Or?
No, it is something that we want to try to not necessarily get grant funding. There's no funding. You have all of our officers, all of our partners volunteer their time to meet and collaborate with this particular project, because most of them have a real vested interest to servicing these types of victims. But we do want to, as part of the coalition, have some fundraisers in order so we can provide training to service providers and members of the community going forward. That's a goal of ours.
Is there like a pamphlet that you give to law enforcement that they can hand out, or?
Not specifically for the coalition, but we do have a domestic violence related pamphlet that we had put together. It was through our Domestic Violence Fatality Review Board that we have provided all law enforcement officers to hand out on scene. And included in that particular brochure, there's a list of like phone numbers and addresses for victims of domestic violence if they would like to get like an order of protection, how they can contact their local justice court and obtain that and get kind of the services that they need.
I would think about it more of the behind the scenes that we do as providers between DCS, the Department of Child Safety, tribal entities, law enforcement, victim services. The coalition is more about what we do to prepare to better serve the victims. It's less direct involvement of the coalition with victims.
Does part of it include evaluating what our different providers are doing now and how we can get better at serving those who become victims?
It does. We definitely address specific cases without talking about the specific people involved, but our agency had a case XYZ. And we kind of do a, what did we do well, what could we do better? And that helps because if we have a case that's in Pine Top, there might be something that's really relevant to the Winslow officers or to our office in Holbrook, where we learn from other people's experiences and we don't all have to kind of make the same mistakes. And then when we do something well, or we have something that really worked in terms of domestic violence, then we all get to learn from that as well.
So, is this something that's going to be continuing, or now that you've kind of broken down those silos, is there still a need for the coalition to go forward? What is its ultimate goal, and what steps are you taking now?
I would absolutely say yes. It is a need going forward. I think one thing that we have learned is that we have to continue to partner with one another. We have to completely understand what it is that we each individually do, because without our partners, it's hard and it's difficult to really provide effective services. If you don't know who's there to provide the victim the need that particular need that they're requesting, or what it is that they can do, just having that conversation, that dialogue is super critical. But in addition to that, I mean, there's a lot of different things that we have identified that Navajo County really needs. We need to have a collective response. We need to be responding to these types of cases all in a very similar fashion. In order to maintain that if a victim is, a domestic violence victim out of Winslow, they're not getting better or worse services than somebody victimized in Show Low. So the uniformness of our responses, we want to eventually develop a protocol or procedures on how we all collaborate and respond to these types of cases. We're going to push the implementation of all agencies providing a high-risk assessment screening tool when they go to these types of cases, so they can properly refer. There's a lot of things we want to work on going forward.
So what is a high-risk screening tool?
So it's a screening tool. It's actually called the Arizona Intimate Partner Risk Assessment Instrument System. And the Family Violence Institute out of Northern Arizona University has worked on gathering data and basically giving us a very thorough risk assessment that's backed up by statistics, so we can say this works and this is how. So it's questions that officers can ask that help them take a deeper look at the case. So for example, has there been an increase in frequency or severity of violence between intimate partners? Have they ever used a weapon? Have they ever tried to kill you?
So these questions are being asked at the scene of the victim.
Exactly, and they can be used by law enforcement to judge how risky kind of the situation is at the moment. It can also be used by prosecutors to inform the judge the judge or the justice of the peace when it comes to release. The Arizona Supreme Court just recently added in its Arizona State Statute 13-3967, and it lets them take that information into consideration on domestic violence cases when they're determining release conditions.
Do we have any law enforcement agencies at this time that utilize that risk assessment tool?
Yes. The Sheriff's Office and Pine Top Lakeside Police Department both are already using something that is very similar. If it's not exactly the same, it is very close. Dr. Websdale from NAU has been implementing it with the Arizona Peace Officer Standards and Training Protocol. So Casey can probably speak more to that. But they're going to start asking agencies to voluntarily implement statewide as of April 2nd, 2018. And then we also have at our annual symposium, the Victims' Rights Symposium on April 27th, 2018, and Dr. Webster will be coming and doing a presentation. And so officers can come learn more about why we do this and how we do this and what information we can gain from these risk assessments.
So on that risk assessment, I know that we've been doing that for quite some time, along with Pine Top. most of the time, as a 31-year veteran, is we already know when we go to that house. Every now and then you go to a house that you haven't been to for domestic violence, but we go to the same people's house repeatedly. And so we see the escalation. However, I think this is very important because it's not memory analysis now. It's written down. I guess what my question to you, Brad, then, is this just checks the box.
It's more than check the box.
Right, but when I say check the box, in other words, it's pretty simple. They're checking a box going, yeah, the violence went up. Do they have to then write that in the report? Or can you use just this form going, yes, the violence has gone up?
One of the things I like about the Spillman system that the Sheriff's Department uses is that those questions are built in to their report when they do a domestic violence report. So they're not doing anything different, but those questions or those fields pop up for them to fill in. So it's reminding them on the scene because they have a card to get that information, and then the Spillman program is almost forcing those officers to fill in those blanks. And as a prosecutor that still does work in the justice courts and the Superior Court, I can tell you that I find that information valuable not only on release conditions, but knowing which one of those defendants I really have to be hard and firm with to make sure that we're trying to protect those victims in the future. So I look forward to the other agencies picking it up. Can the coalition maybe partner with ASPOST and bring the training up here to get it implemented quicker? Maybe do one down south and one up north?
Yeah, actually we have talked about how we could probably bring something like that, like a domestic violence high-risk assessment training to local law enforcement officers.
And I can help you with that.
And that would be one, because that is definitely that would come into and fall into how are we responding? Are we collectively responding? I mean, one thing I wanted to include that kind of answers your question a little bit more as far as these are concerned. I mean, there are some big indicators, like two in particular, is if the victim has been victimized and strangled during any point of their relationship, they're at a much higher likelihood of the domestic violence situation escalating and reaching a homicide situation.
Is that because of national data, statewide data?
It's national screening, but it seems to be, the state has taken a look at this. The coalition pushes these same assessments, and so nationally they look at that, but yes, it seems to be consistent with what we see here in Arizona and in Navajo County.
And just as some numbers, in 2014 there were 109 domestic violence related deaths, and 50,
not in Navajo County.
Not in Navajo County, in Arizona in 2014. And roughly 50% statistically have had prior contact with law enforcement. So what is really interesting about the assessment that the Family Violence Institute has developed is there are these first 7 questions that are like key questions. They're key indicators. If you
I should read some of those.
Yeah. So do you believe that the person is capable of killing you? Is she violently or he violently or consistently jealous of you? And we don't want to pigeonhole this as to being women are always victims and males are always perpetrators, because it certainly happens the other way around as well. Has he or she ever tried to kill you? Has he or she ever choked, strangled, or suffocated you?
So when you ask, have they tried to kill you? I mean, that's a pretty open question. I mean, do they then go, how?
Yeah. Well, in some ways, any attempt at fatal violence would be considered a risk factor. These 7 are just yes or no, but what they've been able to determine is if they have 4 or more of these high-risk indicators, they're 10.5 times more likely to be reassaulted or meet lethal violence. So it's very...
Then Roxanne, you lead the Navajo County Domestic Violence Fatality Review Board. In the cases that you look at, do you see these 7 factors popping up?
So we've done 2 case reviews. We're actually in the middle of our second one right now. And yeah, there are a lot of these indicators that when we're breaking down these types of cases, there are a lot of these indicators that are present in those. And so that's why I can say that there is consistency among national statistics and what we're seeing here in Navajo County.
So we really need to get those other agencies in the county using this risk assessment as soon as possible. But besides those officers getting those yes responses that really indicate that there's a major risk here. Besides arresting the suspect, what else is the coalition suggest that they do at that time to help that victim and to get the other partners in that coalition involved?
Definitely referral to services. I mean, the officers are going to be able to, at that point, like if they have the pamphlet, the domestic violence pamphlet that they have, they can hand that directly to the victim and say, you might, based off of these indicators, you are at a high risk of a lethality. You might want to reach out for additional services. And it's important for people to understand that it's not taboo. I mean, to have or get and obtain services through like a shelter program or through the Victim Services Department for crisis intervention planning and safety planning is something that we can do, and it's super helpful. And a victim can make the decision. Just because you reach out and talk to somebody who is there providing that service doesn't mean you even have to go through with it. But we have shown and we have seen that victims who are provided services from an advocate within about 48 hours of a crime occurring are far less likely to come back into that relationship and or recant later on if there's a prosecution on that case.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's I think it's very important what you're doing there, but what kind of services can you refer the perpetrator to? In other words, you've got to fix that person too.
Mm-hmm.
Both are sick.
Yeah.
Some the victim for staying sometimes, and then of course the perpetrator. So is there something that the coalition can do besides, you know, when it goes to the county attorney's office and the judge and they can order stuff, but is there something?
We don't work on prevention or awareness for the perpetrator. Particularly, we're just providing services to the victims. And I have heard studies.
Let me back you up. So you do you not provide awareness and proactive programs for victims?
Yes.
Okay, but just not for the perpetrators.
Not for the perpetrators, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, so we focus on community awareness, having people recognize kind of, is there anyone in your life that maybe exhibits some of these signs that you want to just let them know you're available and that there's help out there. Our services as coalition members and as Navajo County Victim Services aren't dependent either on the victim wanting to pursue prosecution. And the reason behind that is we really do have to respect the autonomy and what the victim wants. And even if it's not something that we would say we would like, they have the right to choose whether or not they want to stay with their offender. And even though that's difficult for us, because I know Sheriff Clark, you just mentioned that, it's part of the cycle of domestic violence, the power and control. And quite frankly, victims of intimate partner domestic violence are generally at a greater risk during the time that they're choosing to leave or immediately after they have left. So it can be a safety choice over they might want to leave, but their safety sometimes means staying.
And the safety of their kids.
Yes,
quite
kids
often.
is a big point.
One thing someone had told me once is that they know their situation better than you do. And it's very instinctual and to them at some point. And so you have to trust that what they're telling you as far as their risk or their safety is true to them. And we don't try to push them either way. Mm-hmm. But if they're offered services, we can show that they're more likely to leave and they're more likely to come back for help if they even choose to go back and something else continues to escalate.
So you mentioned that part of the coalition's work is community awareness. What projects have you done or are going to implement soon in the future?
Go ahead.
Oh, so in 2016, October is generally Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Actually, Brad and our office, we put on the annual lighting of the courthouse, and we light the courthouse purple, and we put on a little like a service for domestic violence victims at that time. And in 2016, we did a kickoff week where for an entire week we did different activities in order to raise awareness about domestic violence. We did actually, it is called I can't think of the term.
I know they did some community outreach where they went to local law enforcement providers and first responders just to kind of talk to them and open a dialogue about domestic violence, because I do think there's definitely some misconceptions that people have about why do they stay, why do they let somebody treat them like that. So opening a dialogue is a huge part of our community outreach. Another big thing that we've been focusing on lately in victim services is safety planning. If the victim wants to stay currently, what are some things that they can set in place, having copies of important documents, having a place to go, having a plan in place, so that if they decide that it's right for them to leave for their family, they know the safest way to do that. So that's something we've been focusing on, just to make people aware that our services are there and that we can help as much as we can.
One of the latest projects that was actually by law enforcement request is, strangulation is kind of something that's a new developing, I wouldn't call it a new trend, but as far as like providing services or investigating those cases, I don't know how many years it's been, but probably less than 5 years, it's been considered a felony offense to strangle somebody. Before that, it was a misdemeanor offense. So there's a lot of education that needs to go into investigating those types of crimes, particularly because they're so fatal.
Strangulation, not a real,
Right, not a homicide by strangulation.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think it's because there is a high association between strangulation and escalation of domestic violence behavior. So if you are at a place where your partner is choking you or strangling you is the correct term, then that is a higher risk than other behaviors that we see. And actually at our last coalition meeting, one of the law enforcement requests was that we try and get a training for Navajo County on strangulation. So we're working on that right now. We've contacted NACASA, which is the Northern Arizona Center for Sexual Assault, and they may have just changed their name, but that's what they've been known as, just to get some good information, because strangulation is tricky in that there's not always super obvious physical signs. So training officers at what to look at and how to document it, or when to send them for an exam by a nurse examiner, is really important. And so we've listened to law enforcement, and that's one of the great things about the coalition, is it really does give us the opportunity to hear boots on the ground, what's going on, what do you think would help in terms of training and education, and then respond to that as much as we can.
And even the officers that are part of our coalition are helping put together and facilitate this training. So that's really great. I mean, that's how much they want to see that, and it's something we would like to be able to provide annually, because we have new officers and new service providers that come in that need to receive that education. So that's something we're going to be looking at in the future also.
And I know one of the things the Navajo County Attorney's Office, the Navajo County Attorney's Victim Services Division does is puts on an annual Victim Rights Conference. And is some of these themes that we've talked about today going to be a part of that conference?
Yes, in particular, Dr. Websdale will be here to do a workshop presentation on the lethality or high-risk assessments. And the important thing to remember is that there's a big legislative push to make these mandated. So it might come to a point where these will these assessments will have to be applied to victims at the scene of the crime. So we want to make sure that if that's going to be the case, that we're providing everybody with the tools necessary in order to implement those. So yeah, this is definitely one of the things that will be addressed.
And we really appreciate our early adopters like the Navajo County Sheriff's Office and Pine Top Lakeside Police Department. Our training, this symposium is AZ Post, so that's the Arizona Peace Officer Standard in Training. It's AZ Post training hours, so officers can come, they can learn about things that are new, like the Community Informed Risk Assessment. Our keynote speaker this year is Elizabeth Smart, and she's going to speak about her experience being victimized.
That's a familiar name.
I know.
What was her background?
She was a young teenage kidnapping victim out of Utah who was actually held by her perpetrator for several years before being able to escape. And so she's going to come and talk about some of the dynamics that happened in terms of her being taken and why she didn't run immediately. There's a lot of reasons and things that you don't think of as a provider that victims can give us a unique perspective on, and survivors like Elizabeth Smart can really help us understand kind of some of those dynamics.
When is the symposium?
It's April 27th, 2018 at the NPC campus in Snowflake, and you can register. We have a Navajo County Victim Services Eventbrite page, and it's a very minimal registration cost, which is great because bringing this type of awesome training to Navajo County at a low cost is huge. I think we're looking at a $10 registration fee, and lunch is provided by Celebrations. And we have a full day of a keynote, presentations, we have raffles to win lots of prizes, and it's our major training and outreach that we do in the spring.
And who is it attendance open to?
It's open to anybody, any members of the community, any victim services providers, victims themselves if they would like to come. We have, I think, 300 people is the maximum capacity, and we usually get a lot of people. I mean, we get close between 200 and 250 people who attend every year. So we are grateful for that, but there's always some empty seats there, so if people would like to attend, they can.
And don't you typically have a youth program going on at the same time?
Yeah, we offer a youth leadership workshop. And this year it will be particularly addressing victims of sexual abuse, young victims of sexual abuse, which can kind of be, you know, a topic that is hard for parents to talk about with their children. We're looking at some different ideas, maybe venturing that to make it a joint workshop where parents might be able to even bring their children if they're nervous to have conversations about sexual abuse involving children, because the statistics definitely show, and we see all of the time, that these types of things happen to kids that are very young in age, and so we need to have those conversations early on.
So if parents or others interested in attending want more information, who do they reach out to, or where can they go?
They can come and get information from us at the Navajo County Victim Services Department at the County Attorney's Office in Holbrook, or the Eventbrite page. We'll also have on Brad's Facebook page, we'll have regular updates about where to register.
Not my personal one, the county one.
Not
yes,
his personal
our
one.
Navajo County Attorney Office Facebook page. And we have multiple trainings that we put on throughout the year. They're always on. If you go to eventbrite.com and you search for Navajo County Victim Services, you'll be able to find those. Many are free. Some, like the symposium, have a minor cost, but I'm sure we've all experienced going much further and paying much more for various trainings, and so we like to take advantage of what's in Navajo County when we can bring them here. Sorry.
Well, I'm just going to say our time is up. It goes too quickly, so thank you both, Amy and Roxanne, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you for joining us for this month's Shooting Straight with Brad and Casey. And stay tuned for this month's Most Wanted.
The Navajo County Sheriff's Office is currently seeking the location of Robert Allen Manley. Robert is wanted for questioning by the Navajo County Sheriff's Office detectives in connection with an ongoing investigation. Robert has been evading contact from law enforcement for the past several months and has not been able to be located in the Snowflake or Holbrook areas. If anybody has any information about the location of Robert Manley, we encourage you to contact the Navajo County Sheriff's Office at 928-524-4050 or WeTip at 1-800-78-CRIME. A reward may be offered.